didn't know that the most dangerous people are the ones who never raise their voice. I wasn't looking for trouble. And I definitely wasn't looking for love. I just wanted to disappear for a few weeks from a life that had started to feel too small. A new city. A temporary job. A rented room with no personality. Everything felt neutral and safe. That was exactly what I needed. I didn't notice him right away. He didn't try to draw attention. He didn't stare too long. He didn't smile. He was just there, slightly off to the side, like someone observing the world instead of participating in it. When he spoke to me for the first time, it sounded as if we already knew each other. Calm. No flirting. No questions I wasn't ready to answer. His voice was low and controlled, and somehow I immediately felt it. He noticed more than he said. I told myself it was nothing. But that evening, I caught myself checking if he was there again. And that disturbed me more than if he hadn't been. We started talking more often, but strangely, without ever really getting to know each other. I didn't know where he lived. What he did. Why he appeared and disappeared without explanation. Somehow, he seemed to know more about me than I remembered ever telling him. He never asked personal questions. He just dropped comments that made me pause. About running away. About people who are afraid of silence. About how easy it is to lose yourself when you play a role for too long. Around him, I became more careful. I watched my words. My reactions. As if he could see straight through me, even when he wasn't looking at me directly. One day he said, "You're not hiding. You just don't want to be found." I should have laughed. Denied it. Changed the subject. Instead, I stayed quiet. And in that moment, I realized something unsettling. He already had some kind of influence over me. Even though I had never given him permission. I started waiting for him. Not messages, he never texted. I waited for moments. For his presence. For the few quiet sentences that left my mind uncomfortably still. The worst part was how calm I felt around him. Not happy. Not excited. Calm. The kind of calm that only appears when something inside you feels right, even if your logic says it shouldn't. He never touched me accidentally. He always kept distance. But I felt him physically, like pressure, like warm air just behind my back. One evening, he said he would be leaving soon. No explanation. No date. Just a statement. Instead of relief, I felt fear. Real fear. Like something was being taken from me before I had fully understood what it was. That was the first time I thought. Maybe I had already gone further than I planned. And maybe there was no clear way back. After that, I started noticing things I hadn't before. How he always seemed to arrive before I did. How he knew when I was having a bad day without asking. How he never reacted emotionally, never jealous, never impatient, never warm in the way people usually are. It wasn't indifference. It was control. Once, I mentioned a place I used to go when I needed to think. I hadn't been there since moving. A week later, he casually brought it up, describing it so precisely that my stomach tightened. "You said you don't ask questions," I told him. "I don't," he replied. "I listen." That night, I lay awake replaying every conversation we'd ever had. Every detail I'd shared without realizing it mattered. I tried to convince myself I was imagining patterns that weren't there. But a quiet part of me already knew the truth. This wasn't accidental. And neither was his interest in me. I should have pulled away then. That would have been the reasonable thing to do. But instead, I started telling him less, and thinking about him more. He never demanded anything. Never pushed. Never crossed a line that was clearly visible. That was the problem. There were no obvious boundaries to defend. Sometimes he would go silent for days. No explanation. No goodbye. And I hated how deeply that silence affected me. When he returned, he acted as if nothing had happened. Calm. Present. Watching. Once, I asked him why he disappeared like that. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. To see if you'd notice. I laughed it off. But later, alone, I realized how carefully he'd phrased it. Not if you'd miss me. If you'd notice. The first time he touched me, it wasn't accidental. And it wasn't intimate. He simply placed his hand on my wrist to stop me from walking away. That was all. But my body reacted before my mind did. He didn't tighten his grip. He didn't pull me closer. He just held me there, steady and calm, as if he already knew I wouldn't move. You don't have to run, he said quietly. I'm not, I answered. He let go immediately. And that was when it hit me. He wasn't trying to trap me. He was waiting for me to stay on my own. After that, my sense of time around him began to change. Days felt shorter when he was near. Conversations lingered in my head long after they ended. I started measuring moments by his presence instead of the clock. It scared me how naturally it happened, how easily my mind adjusted without asking for permission. He never invited me anywhere. Somehow, I was always the one suggesting it. Coffee. A walk. A place that felt quiet enough to think. He agreed every time, but never seemed eager. As if he knew I would ask eventually. Once, I accused him of being distant. He didn't deny it. Distance is safer, he said. People reveal more when they feel free. I asked him what he meant. He looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "You already know." That night, I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't being pulled toward him. I was being allowed to walk closer. I started lying. Not to him, to myself. I told myself I could stop anytime. That nothing real had happened. That this was just a strange connection I would eventually outgrow. But my body didn't believe any of it. I noticed how I adjusted my schedule without thinking. How I chose routes where I might run into him. How silence from him felt heavier than words from anyone else. One evening, I asked him why he never talked about his past. He smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him. Not warm. Not kind. Controlled. Because people confuse information with access, he said. You don't need one to have the other. That sentence stayed with me. Because I suddenly understood how little I actually knew about him, and how deeply he was already woven into my thoughts. I wasn't inside his world. But he had quietly stepped into mine. The shift happened so subtly I didn't notice it at first. I stopped questioning things that used to bother me. His timing. His silence. The way he always seemed one step ahead of my reactions. Instead of resisting it, I adapted. One night, he said something that made my chest tighten. You're calmer now, he observed. Less defensive. I asked him if that was a good thing. That depends, he replied. On whether the calm comes from trust or surrender. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because in that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't trying to protect myself from him anymore. I was adjusting myself to fit whatever space he was making. And the most frightening part was this. A part of me didn't want him to stop. The first real crack appeared when I tried to pull back. Nothing dramatic. No confrontation. I simply didn't answer when he reached out. I told myself it was healthy. Necessary. A test to prove I was still in control. He didn't react the way I expected. No messages. No questions. No pressure. 2 days later, we ran into each other by chance, or what looked like chance. He greeted me the same way he always did. Calm. Attentive. Unbothered. "You seem tired," he said. That was all. But something inside me shifted. Because he hadn't asked why I disappeared. He hadn't acknowledged the distance at all. And suddenly I understood, he hadn't felt it the way I had. That night, it wasn't his silence that unsettled me. It was how easily he let me go. After that, I started noticing how often my reactions seemed anticipated. I would think about reaching out, and he would appear. I would decide to avoid him, and the opportunity would quietly remove itself. It felt less like coincidence and more like alignment I hadn't agreed to. Once, I asked him if he ever felt out of control. He didn't answer right away. "Control isn't about force," he said finally. "It's about understanding patterns. People repeat themselves when they think no one is paying attention." I asked him if he was talking about me. He met my eyes and held them. "I'm talking about everyone." For the first time, I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear. Recognition. The moment everything changed wasn't loud or obvious. We were standing close, closer than usual, and I realized I was waiting for him to do something. To touch me. To cross a line. To justify the tension that had been building inside me for weeks. He didn't. Instead, he leaned in slightly and said, "You don't need permission to want this." My breath caught. Because he wasn't offering himself. He was removing my excuse. That was when I understood the real danger. Not that he was controlling me, but that he was slowly teaching me to take responsibility for every step I took toward him. And once that happens, there's no one left to blame. After that night, the rules changed even though no one said so out loud. He didn't come closer. He didn't pull away. But the space between us stopped feeling empty. It felt charged, like something waiting to be acknowledged. I became aware of myself around him in a new way. My posture. My tone. The pauses before I spoke. It wasn't fear driving it anymore. It was awareness, the kind that makes you realize you're being seen, not watched. Once, I told him I didn't like how easily he read people. "You like it," he corrected calmly. "You just don't like what it reveals." I wanted to argue. But the truth settled faster than words. Because part of me did like it. The honesty of it. The way nothing felt accidental anymore. What I didn't like was how quickly I'd stopped pretending otherwise. The first boundary I crossed was small enough to excuse. I shared something I'd never said out loud. Not a trauma. Not a confession. Just a detail, a weakness I usually kept buried because it made people handle me differently. He didn't react. No sympathy. No reassurance. No visible judgment. "That explains a lot," he said simply. And somehow, that felt worse than pity would have. Because he didn't treat it like something fragile. He treated it like information. Something to understand, not comfort. Later, alone, I realized what I'd done. I hadn't been pressured. I hadn't been coaxed. I had chosen to give him something real. And once you do that, you can't pretend the connection is harmless anymore. I started noticing how other people felt, distant. Their conversations sounded louder. Less precise. Their concern felt reactive, emotional, messy. Around them, I had to explain myself. Around him, I didn't. That contrast scared me. One evening, I asked him if he ever worried about crossing lines. He considered the question carefully. Lines exist to protect people who don't trust themselves, he said. You trust yourself. That's why you're here. I wanted to say he was wrong. But instead, I felt something settle into place. The realization that I had stopped asking whether this was safe. I was only asking how far it could go.